Hey AML people, what's up, what's up, what's up? As of the time of recording this particular episode number 20, Linda Ikeji's blog had not been shut down yet. It was speculated that it would be shut down, but it was not shut down. As of the time we're now ready to publish this episode, breaking news, her website has been shut down. Several things that I want you all to get from this. Number one, it just really got real. And I want to thank Linda Ikeji for helping me illustrate the point of the respect of the rule of law and intellectual property issues and just generally how our society can change. I think she's a pace setter in so many ways, including getting the entire continent of Africa to pay attention to the importance of the law. Number two, can this be remedied? Absolutely, very easy with respect to her, because her blog doesn't make her. Her brand name as a personality is what makes her. So it's easy for her to get a domain name, even though most of her domain name are taken, but some sort of variety, set up a website, a self-hosted website, and her audience are waiting. They just will go right over. Her sponsors will get back on and life goes on while she hires an attorney to deal with all the other issues if she wants to be bothered with it, or maybe not. But I think it's definitely worth still going after and fighting over that. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think needs to be talked about here is the importance of incorporating. And it's really, really critical here. You've got a blogger who's getting money from all these major corporate sponsors, and a lot of it averaging or estimated $900,000 a year, and no sense of shielding herself. Correct me if I'm wrong, but from all indications, Linda Ikeji did not incorporate her business. So what ends up happening in that instance? Now you've got liability because you didn't incorporate as a business entity, and now someone's just taking you down. Where are your sponsors' ads to reach the people that you want it to reach? Some people may not be satisfied that you're going to a new website and new location and everything else. They want to make sure that you had that kind of traffic juice that would give them visibility. So guess what? They can come after you to pay them all this money that they paid you. And if they come after you, then you're not shielded by your business entity. Instead, they can take the Range Rover you just got, they can take your house, they can take all those things, your personal assets. So you always want to incorporate. Finally, under no circumstances, I'm a firm believer in if someone punches you, you punch back and punch harder. From a legal standpoint, I don't believe in sitting there and taking punches. Very specific to the legal framework. The person who said he was going to take her down that we're all aware of, IED or whoever he is, I've gotten all kinds of emails on who this person is and what he does and all that stuff. But the point is, if he's coming with unclean hands, it's not enough for you to take that kind of punches. You hire aggressive attorneys and you go after this person and you say, Google, it's not that kind of party. And if Google doesn't comply with what you want them to do, you sue Google along with the people that are saying that you did XYZ too. So, it's not one of those situations that you sit and take it. Google has a deep pocket. They're not above the law. You certainly can sue them too. And I think their basis to sue them based on this particular so-called plaintiff, if he's the one that caused the causation of the site shutting down. If it's not the one and it's because she really did infringe on extensively on the intellectual property of all these brands, including American media brands and stuff, then we have a problem. She really, really needs to restructure, understand that she's no longer that single lone blogger. She's become bigger than that. Get the right legal team in place, get the right accounting team in place, and do things right. It just is what it is. You can't claim ignorance for so long. At some point, you really got to shift and become that businesswoman and a formidable one that you already are. Like, step into it. All right, so let me stop there and let's get right into the podcast series. Enjoy it, and please spread this around, share, and let's all get educated. And this is a great case to get educated about the law and its implications from an African standpoint as well as a U.S. standpoint. You're listening to the AfricaMusicLaw.com show with Miss Uduak, episode number 20. AfricaMusicLaw.com, your number one go-to destination for celebrity legal drama, music business, and industry news. Hi everyone, welcome to the AfricanMusicLaw.com show with your one and only certified game changer, Miss Uduak. If you're just joining me for the first time, I'm a fashion and entertainment lawyer with the law firm of AB2 Law Group PC. This show, the AfricanMusicLaw.com show, is a show that is about the business of empowering the African artist. We make no qualms about that. We are about that business, so we take on all kinds of issues that hit mainstream, both here in the U.S. and across the African continent, and we dissect it, chop it up, bring out the legal and business commentary, bring out the legal and business analysis on what ends up being an intersection of pop culture and the law, and sometimes an actual collision of pop culture and the law. We also invite our industry experts, artists, and other cool people to come share their insights with us to benefit you. Now, check this out. I can't wait. Very soon, we're also going to be having you, the AML listeners, coming on the show. I want to talk to you. I want to interact with you. We already are doing so, particularly in our social media networks, your emails. But I really want others to hear your voices, especially a lot of you that I think are absolutely so brilliant and love your emails and your discussions when we get into this legal issues and the whole shenanigans that come with them. Today is packed full of a lot to talk about. I've invited one of my legal colleagues to join me, and you're going to be hearing her in the segment right after this. And we are covering all kinds of issues today. The Inio divorce case, Tiwa Savage and her rumored divorce saga. We're getting into Amber Rose and Wiz Khalifa. We will also look at Chris Brown and the latest accusations that he has trouble with gangs. And then, of course, the big case, TB Joshua. And then we wrap it up with Akon and his performance in Africa in a large-sized balloon, a bubble, which his fans felt that he was doing that to avoid contacting Ebola. So we talk about all those things. We keep it light, but we also keep it heavy, and we have fun with it ultimately, because this is fun for us as much as it's also, or hopefully it's informative for you. Now, this segment, here's what I want to talk about. Actually, before I do, if you're just joining us, there are several ways you can continue to hear what we do here at AfricanMusicLaw.com. You can subscribe on www.africanmusiclaw.com to stay updated on when we publish our weekly podcast. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/AfricanMusicLaw. You can find us on our Twitter handle, African Music Law. And you can follow me, the host, Miss Uduak, on my personal Twitter handle, and that goes at Uduak Law, Uduak Law, Uduak Law. If you'd like to sponsor this show or appear as a guest, I'm always delighted to have you. Please feel free to email me. Just come and have a good time and have fun with me on the show. Now, how's everyone doing? That's a big question I love asking. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope your week was off the hook, amazing, productive, healthy, streamlined, focused, and just you're in a good space. Let me talk about this case before we take a quick break and dive into it. And I introduce our special guest today, who has actually appeared before Miss Uwam. She's a family law attorney with my law firm, actually, AB2 Law Group PC. Most of you that have heard her really like her. And so when we have these issues that involve a lot of family law related matters, I will ask her periodically based on her availability to show up and help us with some insights on this areas of laws. Okay, so check this out. I wanted to talk about one case that's been setting the internet ablaze. That case, or the case that I'm talking about, is the Linda Ikeji case versus a guy on Twitter called IAD. Linda Ikeji, for all who have no clue, is a celebrity blogger out of Nigeria. She started blogging about the same time I did, actually a little longer than me, 8 years. I'm 7 years now. Bella Naija, I think, is also 8 years. And over time, within the past 4 years, she's all of a sudden started to do really good. So much so, she's averaging about $900,000 a year as a blogger. That's what she does exclusively. And she has a lot of ads as well as sponsored posts on her site. Now, here's what's interesting. Over time, she's had a lot of different brouhahas with all kinds of people claiming defamation, or if they're not, copyright or intellectual property infringement. Well, recently, a guy by the name or Twitter handle Mr. IAD essentially accused her of copyright infringement, took it to Twitter, and then said that, hey, he has contacted Google, who happened to be her internet service provider because she hosts on Blogspot and doesn't have her own self-hosted website. And ultimately, Google then basically took some posts down. But not only did Google take some of this post down, he claimed that the site would be shut down pretty soon. Now, the site averages like millions per month in terms of page views. So, of course, all of her readers and all of her followers get concerned. My curiosity for what I do at africanmusiclaw.com obviously and naturally gets piqued. I wrote an article about it. And I addressed this issue that, hey, we're going on the 14th case now. Is this the year that this young woman is going to be sued? Which, if you do business, whether in the US or outside of, it's inevitable at some point that someone will either threaten to sue you, or you'll be the one suing. It just is what it is. It's the nature of business. And if you understand business, it's just what it is. That's why you get your, legal team together. It's sort of the same thing with the accounting. At some point, if you start making money, if you don't account properly, the IRS will come after you. And you have to explain to Uncle Sam what it is you're doing or not doing in terms of your taxes and how you're filing it, etc. So there's so many things that come with this whole process. So the only thing I was interested in finding out was, with this Linda Ikeji case, is she indeed infringing on intellectual property of other people? The allegation is that she's cutting and pasting other people's work with absolutely no attribution whatsoever and presenting those works to be hers. Linda herself has admitted to that. But she says everybody does that. Let's be clear. Just because everybody does that doesn't mean that it is right. Copyright infringement is copyright infringement. I've talked about copyright infringement so many times, both written as well as podcast show. I did talk about it in the Lecrae podcast show, so please be sure to check out that podcast show, because I go through the analysis of what constitutes infringement. So I'm not going to spend that time here. But what I will say is, what was interesting was, this guy called IAD is interesting. So he goes on and on and on and on. I mean, it's like a whole massive tweet and barrage of this, hey, gotcha, we're going to get you kind of stuff. And I just thought it was odd. It was just a lot. It appears that, they're legitimate points that this young lady, celebrity blogger, Linda Ikeji, has been taking people's content and reposting on her site. She admits to that. She says she can learn and do better. She does say other people do it. Like I said, so what if other people do it? That doesn't make it right. We all know that. Make the long story short, this guy, accuses this young woman of intellectual property infringement of his work. So think of him as a plaintiff or a litigant in a courtroom, going through his attorney to file paperwork and telling the court, in federal court in the US, because Google is located in Mountain View. Arguably, this guy's in the US, also New York, Minneapolis, or Minnesota. I'm not sure which jurisdiction, based on all the documents out there. But he's in the US, so we're going into federal court. We know that much. And he wants to claim copyright infringement. Well, it's all good and dandy, but the basic premise of law is you, the plaintiff going in, can't go into a courtroom with unclean hands. That's extremely disrespectful to the court. But beyond being disrespectful to the court, you don't have any kind of strong standing. You may be able to say, hey, you know what, intellectual property infringement. What's your credibility on this alleged intellectual property infringement? If we cannot trust your word, how the heck can any lawyer walk into a courtroom and defend you when you have unclean hands? That's the fundamental question that I posed. And the reason I posed this question was initially after writing this, very legitimate points that this guy had posted, that Linda Ikeji had infringed on intellectual property. He had taken all the necessary protocol to do what he needed to do. Because of his continued, slaughter of her on Twitter, basically, I decided that, let me check out who this guy is, because he should have stopped by now. It keeps going on. So now let me talk about the real thrust of this issue. And I want each and every one of you hearing the sound of my voice to really get it. Africans and particularly Nigerians, The issue here is not whether Linda Ikeji infringed on the copyright of this young man, IAD, whoever he is, Mr. IAD, Emmanuel F. Remove, I really don't know. That is not the issue, because arguably he can establish, based on what he's saying, that some sort of violation took place. Let's just give him that he can establish that. But don't let this character distract you. And here's why. I posed this question and I want that answer to that question. You've got a potential plaintiff in a courtroom who owns hundreds of websites, and his media company is called 15past8.com. 15past8.com also owns the website called nigalife.com, spelled the number 9 life.com. On nigalife.com is clearly indicated that 15past8.com is the owner of nigalife.com. Well, when you look at the registration information on who owns nigalife.com, the name of the person who owns nigalife.com is Emmanuel Efremov. Who is Emmanuel Efremov? We don't know. Assume hypothetically that somehow Emmanuel Efremov is not the Twitter handle Mr. Ikeji. Can somebody explain to me why 15past8.com, Mr. Ikeji's company, who has Niger Life registered under Emmanuel Efremov, can someone tell me why the same Emmanuel Efremov of 15past8.com has Linda Ikeji.net registered under his name? That's problematic. That's cyber squatting. Because the whole idea is when you're getting all those websites, is the idea and concept that you're going to turn around and ask the original domain name owner or trademark owner, Linda Ikeji, trademark owner, to sell it to that person for a higher sum of money. And when you look at the history of this Emmanuel Efremov, there's actually a WIPO case against this guy. And there's a long pattern of history. And then, of course, Linda's response says, yeah, there's a problem. This guy owns about 8 of my sites. Why does this matter? It matters because we're talking about credibility. First of all, if you have an attorney representing your interest and you come with dirty hands, it's just not going to work for the attorney. You're wasting everyone's time. Go home. You are wasting everyone's time. In the legal justice system, there's a theory called clean hands doctrine or the dirty hands doctrine. And what it is an equitable defense. And the way it works is the defendant or the plaintiff is going to say, hey, Mr. Ikeji, okay, yes, okay, so I infringe on your intellectual property rights. Okay, all right. But guess what? You're acting unethically and you're acting in bad faith. Because the subject of what you are talking about, lindaikeji.net.com, .blogspot, blah, 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 the subject of the complaint that you have filed has unclean hands. How do we know that it has unclean hands? We know because you have lindaikeji.net registered, and that registration links back to your site, and there's no plausible logical reason why your company name and your company identity and this character of an Emmanuel Efremov is associated with your company and Linda Ikeji. What? There's no logical connection. There's nothing else except if you purchase that site for yourself and other sites that she claims. So let's focus on lindaikeji.net. That's the point. And it is a significant point. It's a significant point from a practical aspect. Significant because you cripple your case before we even start. How is a lawyer going to walk into a courtroom with a client with unclean hands and somehow create or put up a case? How is that going to happen? So for those who are so caught up in the intellectual property issue, intellectual property doesn't work only in its own isolated space. Law is not just IP alone. Even within IP, you're talking about business context, business law, and all the other different branches of the law that intertwine. In this instance, one is intertwining. We cannot ignore this fundamental issue of credibility. And because we cannot ignore it, this particular plaintiff has to explain, or potential plaintiff has to explain that issue on why 15past8.com has nigalife.com as its property, and nigalife.com is registered to Emmanuel Efremov, and Emmanuel Efremov, who's part of this 15past8.com and nigalife.com, owns lindaikeji.net. That is an issue. So no amount of distraction, no amount of claiming Nigerians are this, Nigerians and that, and blah, 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 can absolve and resolve that issue. And because it's tainted everything, it affects everything. And here's why this really, really bothers me. Our journalists are really suffering in Nigeria. Our journalists are really suffering in Nigeria. There's no question about it. People write extensively, can't get paid for what they do. I happen to have a communications degree. I've been in journalism for a little while now. My counterparts in Nigeria can't even afford to pay rent or take care of their families. People lifting content is a major issue. Even with me blogging about the law, I see people just lift my content, and it's like quite interesting. It's so sometimes quite interesting. Other situations where my content has been published on a nationwide basis in Nigeria, I've followed up and something was done about it. So, and that was by a major newspaper. So it's a real issue. People copying and pasting content with absolutely no regard for, how much hard work the writer put into it. So when this issue is raised, it cannot be in a situation that clouds the ultimate, very, very important question that this issue is raised and still needs to be addressed. And what better person for us to address this underlying issue, and even as a case study, than Linda Ikeji? I mean, she has a lot of influence and power. And, hey, we should be having these discussions. But when you have a character like Ikeji who shows up, raises a legitimate point, but does it in a way that piques other people's curiosity, and it turns out that his hands are unclean, then he's actually caused us more injury than you can imagine. For those journalists out there, bloggers, and people who work so hard to create their content and can't seem to, make a living off it, it'd be better to have somebody else pushing forward that particular objective than him. So that's the point. We'll take a break. When we get back, we'll get right into our cases and our updates for today. And we really take on the TB Joshua case. You're listening to the AfricanMusicLaw.com show. Welcome back, everyone, to the AfricanMusicLaw.com show with your one and only certified game changer, Miss Uduak. So we get right into it. I already told you guys we're taking some of the top legal stories, or stories that are hitting the web that have a lot of legal connotations to them, and we are analyzing them. And to help me today, I've got my esteemed colleague, Miss Uwam. Miss Uwam, would you say hello to the Africa Music Law listeners?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me on the show, Miss Uduak.
It's always a delight to have you. Our audience loves you, and we love having you on. So let's get right into it. The first case that we want to talk about is the Inio case. For people just listened for the first time, here are the facts on Inio. She's an actress out of Nollywood, has been able to gain a lot of notoriety across the continent of Africa, and of recent, or lately actually, signed up to become, or is actually just recently signed up to become a lawyer. So she's in law school learning some law stuff. Well, it's quite interesting because she also got married some few years back, approximately 5 years in the USA, to a US-based husband, now an ex-husband, and she recently filed for divorce. When she filed for divorce, no one really knew what was going on. But of late, what's been interesting is that there have been accusations and allegations that she cheated on her ex-husband. So Inio came out and took to Twitter and said, look, I never cheated on my husband. I filed for divorce based on irreconcilable differences, and so people just let me be. Now, you would think that's the end of it, but what ends up happening is her relatives on her ex-husband's part basically grant an interview to a media company, and they say, you know what? If you continue to claim that you did not cheat, we're going to expose you, and we're going to tell the truth, because supposedly, or they allege that they caught her cheating on her ex-husband. My question to you, Miss Uwam, what do you think, and what's your take about that, particularly with in-laws granting interviews to media, threatening to expose, somebody who's already divorced?
Well, honestly, that is so irrelevant. I mean, to the extent that it is relevant, it's your market. You're looking at your market. Here in the United States, I believe she got married in Texas, I think. I'm not too sure what Texas law is and how Texas does its thing. But irreconcilable differences is if that's the legal basis for the divorce, which is almost similar to California, then that's what it is. We just can't get along. We have differences that we, can't seem to work through. And so the marriage ends. This whole thing about cheating and this and that, to the extent that it's relevant, it's only to her reputation. And obviously the Nigerian market cares about stuff like that because that's the culture. So what is that? Does she have to be worried about anything? Yeah, because that's where her market is. If she plans on doing more movies out there and attracting that market, then yeah, she probably has to now work on the PR angle of this and probably hire a good PR team to get about doing a good job for her. It's quite unfortunate because if she was out here and they were to make statements about quote unquote her cheating, if it turns out, in fact, that she can prove she wasn't cheating, then that's defamation, and that entitles her to bring their butt in court and make their lives miserable by affecting their pocketbook. I think, this marriage is over. The parties have moved on. Family members move on.
I agree with your analysis, and I would say also my understanding is that the wedding may have taken place here and that the family members, some of them, are located here in the U.S. And I did put something up on the blog that if indeed that's the case, like you just said, Mr. Wam, she should be definitely thinking about pursuing legal action. I think the time where you just sit and take people saying all kinds of crap about you and you say, oh, you know what, I have no recourse, is over. If you're in the U.S., set the example so they know that this is not tolerated. Let's go to yet another divorce saga or rumored divorce saga, and that's the case of Tiwa Savage and T-Billz. We've talked about Tiwa Savage and T-Billz in the past. If you're just joining us again, here are the quick facts. Tiwa is a famed musician. Her husband is a music manager, and he has been largely responsible for her success. They met in Los Angeles, California at some concert, and at that point started to work together. He invested in her first music video titled Kele Kele, Love, and he's managed her ever since. She's a brand ambassador for Pepsi. She's a brand ambassador for some major brands in Nigeria and across Africa, and she's loved by a lot of people. When she got married to T-Billz, most people were not happy because T-Billz has a woman, baby mama drama, 2 kids from prior relationship with a woman in Los Angeles, California. So they got married in April. It was a huge wedding. It was in Dubai. It was, televised everywhere across the continent, that is, and shared on social media extensively. And all of a sudden, we're in October, and it's this huge news about them allegedly breaking up, with all kinds of stories about domestic violence, stories about mismanagement of funds by her husband, to the point where there is now a replacement with a new music manager managing her affairs. We don't know the truthfulness of those allegations, but I think it's worth discussing, particularly on a domestic violence situation, and also getting a take or view that if indeed this happens and there is a divorce, what are we looking at? So let's get some insight from our expert here, Ms. Uwa.
So Tiwa Savage, I have to say, I love Tiwa Savage. I love Tiwa Savage. I think she's an absolutely talented artist and has a lot going on for her. It's unfortunate if this so-called rumored divorce and the basis for the divorce or the separation from the manager and so forth has to do with the domestic violence issues. Of course, to every woman out there, and of course men, because oftentimes we only think domestic violence is only against women, but there are a lot of women out there who also do perpetrate domestic violence on their opposite sex. So Tiwa Savage, girl, leave. You're talented, you're beautiful, you're intelligent, you can make it on your own, and you cannot be so dependent on anyone to think that you have to tolerate them treating you less than who you are so that you can quote unquote make it in the industry. That's absolutely nonsense. Now they sing the song. It's not him that sings it. It's your voice. As to the issue of getting divorced and so forth, I'm assuming they got married back home. And so that were the case, obviously they would have to settle the divorce based on what the laws of Nigeria is. If it turns out that maybe they did in fact get married out here in the United States, then I think they were based in LA at some point, California. So obviously California law would apply if in fact they were married here, or if they were to attempt to get a divorce in California. California law would apply. Although the properties that are any land properties that are owned in Nigeria would obviously, the California court would necessarily have jurisdiction all the way across continent to Africa. That's debatable. It's a whole different legal analysis. But ultimately, if it's California, anything that they both acquired during the course of the marriage is split in half. Anything she had on her own prior to the marriage, so long as she didn't mingle or change the title of the property, belongs to her. And likewise, the same thing with him. If they started a business together before they got married, then, the business would be divided accordingly with, partnership rules of business law. Now, if the business continued during the course of the marriage, then now it gets a little complicated, because now you've got to portion out, okay, well, we started this business before we got married, and then we continued the business after we got married, and we would acquired all those things. The business has grown, so you would have to be very careful in sorting out, because the laws apply differently to a business that started before as opposed to a business that's after, or rather during the course of the marriage. When it's all said and done, I think we had a podcast on this particular issue, and I said, I'm not feeling this Tiwa Savage and her husband thing. This doesn't look right. Just because we were talking about the video that she had created, and it just didn't look right. So I wish her all the best, and assuming she's in California for her divorce, then we'll have a lot more to talk about.
It's funny that you say you didn't think or feel that it was right between Tiwa and her husband. I still feel the same way, no matter how much I try. It just, there's that sort of feeling or intuition or instinct that something doesn't feel right. You think he's good, he's been able to be very helpful to her career, but let's see how it plays out, So let's talk about the next case, which is also actually a divorce case involving Amber Rose versus Wiz Khalifa. Those two did some serious PDA, public display of affection, like nobody's business. Amber Rose used to date Kanye West. That didn't work out. Ultimately hooked up with Wiz Khalifa, and they were everywhere with PDAs. They got married almost a year now, have a child, Sebastian, and all of a sudden, Amber Rose files for divorce from Wiz Khalifa, and she cites irreconcilable differences. And Ms. Uwam, I'm going to ask you what that really means. Although you've just talked about it, you've explained what that means, but just to shed more light on it. And next thing you know, while fans are trying to deal with all of that, Wiz Khalifa and Amber Rose, basically allegations of cheating goes back and forth. And ultimately, Amber Rose says, I filed a divorce because he cheated on me. I caught him cheating on me. So it's just been all kinds of mess, and it seems like it might be a very nasty fight. Could you break down the discussion or analysis, particularly on custody issues since they have a child in this instance, and what, all of this really means?
So, I've heard of Amber Rose. I'm not really a big Amber Rose, I think I'm saying her name right, fan to the issue. If it's California related, married in California or getting a divorce in California, they have one child. I'm assuming that if they're both willing to work together and be parents, just because your marriage is over doesn't mean your role as parents is over. And it's so important for both people to make sure that the best gift they can give their children in the midst of divorce is to learn how to love that kid far more than they hate each other, so they can work together for the best interest of that child. So based on that, if the both of them can work this issue out together, then they may not need the court order than just a signature from the court. agreeing that the both parties have come to an agreement on how they want to work with their kids in terms of sharing, visitation, all that stuff. Assuming they don't, it can be very nasty because parents get very emotional when it comes to their children. They'll spend millions of dollars to fight over their kids. And I'm assuming that either side will be claiming that they're supposed to be, a better parent than the other and should have the child. Anyways, so that's, as far as custody, just keeping it mildly and lightly, that's the potential that can come out of that. There could be allegations such as abuse, and hopefully they don't go there if it's not true, because there is a tendency sometimes in family court to have people raise allegations of abuse in order to get the upper hand in custody battles, which is fundamentally so ridiculously unfair and just creates such a very nasty bitterness that ends up affecting the child or children. As to division of their assets and properties, I don't know what they own together or don't own. So it seems like Amber Rose already had her career going prior to marrying Wiz Khalifa, and he also had his career going prior to marrying her. So we're really talking about anything they brought into the marriage that was independently owned by them, acquired by them, becomes a separate property. Again, that could get a little complicated depending on how they handle those separate properties when they got married. Because you have something that's a separate property before you got married, doesn't mean during the course of the marriage you don't tamper with that separate property. You could commingle it, you could gift it to the community, so it now becomes a community asset. So a lot of wrangling that can occur there. So if they kept it separate, able to show that they did own and keep it separately, then that stays with them. Now, everything they acquired during the course of the marriage is community property, and that needs to be split in half by both parties. If they had any business ventures together, that's when things start getting a little tricky and complicated. And, you're going to maybe need a business expert, evaluation expert to come and assess and value the business and what it's worth. And there are two standards predominantly used to evaluate business ventures by spouses. So obviously the expert will be testifying to that. Again, that gets a little more complicated and into more deeper analysis. This whole he cheated, she cheated, that used to be relevant back in the day, and I mean back in the day, when fault divorce was the law of the land. But we are now a no-fault jurisdiction. We don't care if the other guy cheated. We don't care if you cheated, she cheated. It's we don't get along. Irreconcilable differences is simply we don't get along. We can't seem to meet eye to eye, and we have to call it quits. That's different from maybe trying to do an annulment, for example, with like Kim Kardashian and Chris. I don't recall what his last name is, but in their situation, and he wanted the marriage annulled because he said, hey, it was based on fraud. So that's another ground, and it's a very complicated ground. There are a lot of proofs that you have to go through to establish that. Whereas irreconcilable differences is simply, hey, we don't get along. I need to go my way, you go your way. That's a much easier standard to establish. And then you're really more focusing on the issue of property and children as to any disputes.
I didn't ask you this before, but I'm curious the role of domestic violence in a divorce situation. I know we mentioned domestic violence with the Tiwa Savage and said get out of it, but does it have any bearing in divorce proceedings?
Absolutely. And there are a whole set of rules and body of laws under family law that covers domestic violence issues and proceedings as far as divorce goes. And oftentimes, you see it more in terms of the protection of, for example, when you file things, you may have to put your address in there. But if this falls under a domestic violence matter, then you may not, don't have to disclose, your address and those kinds of information. Children becomes an issue because, the sharing of the kids, if you don't feel safe, and obviously especially the violence has been committed around the children, then he can almost not get any visitation, or if he does, he might be getting supervised visitation. As to assets, is very possible, but it all depends on, what's going on in the case. As you know, there's no one set rule in law. to do the analysis and come to the conclusion of, okay, does he get any assets here? Does he not get any assets? What exactly is going on here? It's not uncommon to find in domestic violence matters, family law, divorce related, to also have, especially if the other spouse is not working or was not working in the course of the marriage, to have maybe something like the attorney fees paid and all that kinds of this stuff. So there are some people who raise that issue as well and make allegations of that because they feel they'll get the upper hand again. But it kind of messes it up for the people who seriously went through divorce, domestic violence in their relationship. But yes, it can have some positive, especially because in domestic violence situations, the other person, especially the one with the higher earning power and was earning most of the money during the course of marriage, wants to control. So they can deny assets, access to assets they would, in the form of using that as a form to control the other spouse. So that is where the family court is really helpful in really dealing with those kinds of issues. But yes, domestic violence as it relates to divorce is handled very delicately, and there are bodies of laws on the family law to cover that.
Great, Miss Uwam. Thank you so much. Wow, such insight for me also just listening to you. Let's leave family law and let's go into criminal law, and actually criminal law and a little bit of psychology here. And that's Chris Brown. We've talked about Chris Brown in the past here on the AfricanMusicLaw.com show. And we've talked about him in the context of, is he growing? Where is he going with his career? And all the crazy shenanigans that seem to follow him and, criminal rap sheet. Well, this time around, TMZ is reporting a rather interesting story. And that is that Chris Brown's current girlfriend and his mother are a bit concerned that his life is in danger. And as such, they have approached his current therapist and sought help because they believe that his affiliation or his association with gangs, specifically the Blood, might put him in danger in terms of his life. So I've had the opportunity in my criminal defense work to take on some really, really intense gang cases. Any kind of association could potentially lead to criminal charges. So I don't know why he's even touching or messing with that, considering his criminal history, being on probation and recently and all those other things. But I don't necessarily want to come from that angle on this particular case. What I'd like to know from Ms. Uwam particularly is, what are some of the factors in your experience, having worked, with a lot of law enforcement and stuff? What are some of the factors that pushes, young people particularly to affiliate with gangs?
Well, I don't know if you're going to call Chris Brown young. How old is he now? Isn't he an old fart already? How old is Chris Brown? In his 20s still? I don't know why I thought Chris Brown was already in his 30s. I'm not quite sure what's motivating Chris Brown to associate or affiliate that way. I am not a Chris Brown fan, and it isn't so much because I don't believe he's redeemable and that, if you commit a domestic violence act, that means your life is over and you'll never be a good person. But it's because I am not convinced that Chris Brown himself has taken responsibility for those actions, that Chris Brown himself has sought the appropriate and care and deep reflection that he needs to in order to move on with his life. His actions since that whole situation happened has really been terrible and very unimpressive. And it just seemed like he was more worried about keeping his record deal going and staying in front of the media and TV instead of really taking time out to go take care of himself. So does this surprise me? No, it's quite unfortunate, but we kind of knew he was troubled. He's been troubled for a while. When you go from being a darling, loved by all, and then hated by most, I can be very damning for a young man his age who, thinks he's God's gift to the world, So, are gangs dangerous? Yes. Why? Because of the practice of the mentality of being in a gang. Violence, drugs, that kind of stuff. Stealing. Now, if you could eliminate all of that, I actually think that the concept of gang makes a lot of sense. I think because, it's a social bonding forming, of people coming together under whatever they view as the values that are important to them. If we could just reverse the mentality of it and gear it towards something more positive, almost every community in the hood and anywhere else would be so strong, because you have people bodied together, working together to support each other. They could help with the homework. The mother who can't be at home to supervise her kids, that could be something they could do. They could organize haircuts for kids in the neighborhood. Even if they charge $1 per haircut, that helps that mother that can't afford to take her child to that store and pay $12 to have that child's haircut. So there's some really valuable things I think that can come from that whole concept of organizing as an entity. What attracts people into the gang? Various reasons for everyone. Obviously, we're looking for something, right? We are looking for something. Wherever we go to fill that need, right, determines where our paths are going to go in life. So for some people, the gang provides security, a sense of feeling loved and protected, whatever. Even if we think the concept of that protection is wrong, the point is that's a need that they feel they have in their life that they need to fill up. And oftentimes, if a young man or young woman's growing up in a very tough neighborhood and they have to walk through that neighborhood every day, scared to death and intimidated by other groups, they might feel so inclined to join a group in which they feel they can get protection. So this is actually a conversation that we can have for, go on and on and on. It's a, very deep conversation. But I will say, coming back to Chris Brown, I think Chris Brown is still searching. I think Chris Brown has a lot of pain from what happened with Rihanna that he still hasn't gotten over. And I don't think it's so much the fact that he hurt Rihanna that's still holding him back. I think it's the people's reaction to him. I think it's the world's reaction to Chris Brown that is still holding Chris Brown back. And that's why I insist that Chris Brown hasn't gotten to a place where he's taking care of himself yet. Once he does, he will be able to let go. Because regardless of how people think about you, you have to understand that when you are set for the transition in your life that you're trying to go, that change you're trying to come about because it's healthy for you and will bring you to a better part of who you know you're capable of being, you cease carrying the burden of being rejected, and instead you carry the understanding and appreciation for, wow, that's how hurt people respond to bad behavior. Do you understand what I'm saying? So he hasn't gotten there yet. I don't know how much longer it'll take him. But in the meantime, Chris Brown, do me a favor. Don't be producing no kids, because I heard somebody saying you talking about you ready for a family. Not yet. Please.
So interesting. So interesting. And you know what's even more concerning is the fact that reports that LAPD has said or has contacted clubs and said, hey, be careful with, they tried to reach out to LA club owners to urge them not to book Brown for shows because according to them, it seems like violence follows him wherever he goes and is initiated by his own crew. And that's significant because now you can't even book club shows and you're going to start losing money. And that's huge. You have anything to add to that?
Well, I believe that's part of why he's still stuck where he's at. Because remember when the Rihanna story broke, it started affecting his pocketbook for a minute there. I don't know how significant, but I know that he got dropped in places. People didn't want to, I don't think his CD sales was as high as it was. Subsequently, he has been able to do a lot of stuff, whether it's singing with other people on their album, producing his own. So is it going to affect his pocketbook where he can no longer be booking shows? Absolutely. But it goes back to, again, what I'm saying. It's all the choices that he's making, and they're having an impact on the path that he's going. So you can stop and blame everyone all you want, but it doesn't change the fact that at the end of the day, Chris Brown, you are making the choices that you are, and people are going to continue to react. If you don't like the way people are responding to you, change your choices.
AML people, let's take a quick break. We'll be right back to finish up with two of our main outstanding legal cases to look at, the TB Joshua case, and then, of course, one other one, not quite legal, but I think you guys will enjoy it. We'll be right back. You're listening to the AfricanMusicLaw.com show with your one and only certified game changer, Miss Uduak. Welcome back, everyone, to the AfricanMusicLaw.com show. Thanks for listening. Now we get into the TB Joshua case. I've been asked by so many people to talk about this case and my insight, and I, of course, also have Ms. Uwam to share her insights. So why don't we begin with the facts of this case? I think that's a good place to start. On September 12, 2014, a 6-story building owned by prominent Nigerian pastor TB Joshua collapsed. The building was located in Ikotun, Lagos. And from all reports out there, supposedly about 86 bodies were recovered, although the South African president reports that 150 people were dead and 84 of them were South Africans. And so it's really, really a tragic situation. You know, death, broken bones, all kinds of injuries, spinal cord injuries, all kinds of injuries. According to the National Emergency Management Agency, they said about 131 persons were rescued. And now this is where things really start heating up and getting even more interesting and tragic. Lagos state government claims that the church did not get the necessary approval before it embarked on construction of this 6-story building. Lagos State says one thing, the National Emergency Management Agency says another thing. They say that it was a 4-story building with 2 extra unauthorized buildings added to it. Lagos State, through the Physical Planning and Urban Development Agency, says it was actually a 2-story building with an extra 4 added. What does the owner of the building, TB Joshua, the pastor, what is he saying actually happened? He's saying it's an act of terrorism. He initially blamed Boko Haram, but overall, he just says it's an act of terrorism. And here's what he says happened. He said, first, we have an approval, but the documents are buried along with the collapsed building. The government says, no, we have no record of such approvals. That's not true. He says, no, it's true. Both TB Joshua and other third parties say the evidence of a terrorism act is a CCTV video footage that he released and other third parties released. In that footage, what we see is a plane that has been dubbed a strange aircraft. We see the plane at 11:30 a.m., 11:43 a.m., 11:45 a.m., and 11:54, so 4 times. And that's on the same September 12th. And the plane is flying over the building, like in very close range over the roof of the building. Shortly after the 4th time we see the plane, the entire building collapses to rubbles. It's not even a crack or anything. It's just collapses flat. Now, there's allegation that there were some powerful explosives that may have been used, but we don't know. After the building collapsed, it gets even more interesting because there's an allegation that the emergency workers and journalists that showed up were prevented by the church from accessing the site of the incident to rescue people and report the accident respectively. The allegation is that more lives could have been saved if they were allowed to get access into the building, with the rubbles to find bodies as soon as possible. So there are lots of facts to sift through. And the first thing I want you guys to understand is that this is what is known as complex litigation. And it's complex litigation because there's so many parties involved, and establishing the issue of what actually caused this building to collapse can and is challenging. Before we go any further, let me turn over to Ms. Uwam to talk about a little bit about the facts and your general take so far so good on this case.
Well, first, I want to say that this is exactly what is wrong with Nigeria. And until we get our acts together, we will continue to struggle with issues like this. There is no way a building like this collapses in the United States, and we can't track whether there was proper permits or approval given for this building. We can't track who the contractors were that actually built this building and see the sketches and so forth. We can't track whether or not there were inspections to these buildings, any foundational issues, and whether the pastor or the church was notified of this and there were any changes. It's structural issues with this building we don't even know, because we don't have any way of assessing that. So it's unfortunate, and unfortunately a lot of family members who are sitting waiting for answers are most likely probably never going to get the answers that they're looking for. So my heart goes out to them, and I tell them that we keep them in our prayers every day, and we hope that this incident serves as a lesson moving forward, because that's probably the best thing that's going to come out of this. Serves as a lesson moving forward for changing our structure, but also for people who choose to build buildings to be conscientious. Now, what happened here obviously is key once you start talking legal stuff. But before we can even get into the legal stuff, because law is all about taking facts and marrying the facts to your statute, to your ordinances, to your codes. So until we can gather facts, law just kind of sort of sits there. So what are the facts? If we can't get government agencies, it sounds like I heard you mention at least 3 government agencies who are all telling different stories. That's alarming. So how do we even get to see or deal with the issue of culpability here, for purposes of even from a criminal point of view, if the government can even bring any criminal action against the church? And from a civil point of view, how do we deal with culpability when we can't even get our government agencies to give us a true story on exactly what was going on with this building? Is there a likelihood that this might have been a terrorist act? Maybe, if in fact the facts are as described with the plane and so forth. But again, where are the federal aviations back home that are monitoring these things, that have, air traffic and all that stuff, that have, keep an eye on these kinds of things to give us an accounting of, okay, yeah, this is what was going on with the plane. This is what was seen, or can those things not be seen? I don't know. But these are the kinds of questions that I believe Nigerian citizens want answers to, and the families more than anything else want answers to. And I think until we can get to those, it's really difficult really talking about legal culpability. But there are a lot of hands here that can be affected. Not just the church, but you're talking about your government agencies. And if in fact they had a responsibility, if you can establish that the building was a structural issue, then we start worrying about, okay, well, does Nigeria have policies and things in place for inspecting buildings of that nature? And how is it that they were able to build more building on top of something they weren't supposed to do, and that was not seen or known by any agency, any government agencies? So that's an aspect that obviously needs to be explored. As to the pastor and more lives being saved and people being prevented from coming into, we don't know the facts. We're just hearing stories, and no one seems to be able to have stories that are all complete. If in fact he was doing that, then that's definitely culpability on his part, because he cannot interfere with the ability for people to rescue when there is clearly an emergency at hand. So again, we wait to get more facts, but for the path from the church and the pastor's perspective, this clearly is a PR nightmare to the T. I mean, to the T. And I don't even know they have a PR team in place to begin to work and sort all of this out on behalf of the church. Because the church is about ministry and helping and healing and protecting and saving in terms of bringing people to Christ and so forth. So when your PR looks this way, it's alarming. And now we're talking about international involvement, people from other countries being involved. So you've got multiple culpability on all levels. So definitely need to get the PR team going to begin to put a face and a sense of humanity to this church and what's going on. Otherwise, whatever recovers out of this, there may never be a church again with that name.
That's some great points you raise. And let me answer the question of PR and humanity. 6 days after the fact, the pastor finally adds something, sends its sympathy Subsequently, about 2 weeks ago, he releases a video. It's his first time speaking to his audience, to his church, and he spends about 30 minutes talking, and most of it is focused on this terrorism theory and how the aircrafts are flying up and down. In addition, bad PR follows because a journalist interviews or tapes responses and statements by the pastor where he has journalists in his midst, and he clearly acknowledges that there's an issue and that it's bad PR for them. And so he now starts to ask what they're going to write. But he didn't stop there. He now gives them 50,000 naira each for them to, supposedly that's for petrol, so gas for their food in order to get home. And then after he does that, he asks, so what are you now going to say? What exactly are you going to say? So one journalist did not take the money. And then he comes and he writes this thing like, you can't do that. You're trying to influence. It's bribery. You're trying to influence what we have to say. And that's fundamentally wrong. And why is the state government and others seeming to support you? This journalist and other people have been calling for prosecution of TB Joshua. They feel that the state is not as responsive. This just happened on September 12th. So they feel that by now, there should have been certain investigations and results, which I disagree. I think this kind of cases take a long time to investigate, although investigation should be on right away. I'm going to get your feedback on that point, but just to address some of the key things you raised, important about fact gathering and what's wrong with our system, particularly back home in Nigeria. One of the key things when you have a complex litigation like this from a legal standpoint is, first of all, you need your accident reconstruction experts. They're the ones that are going to come and reconstruct what happened and tell you the details of it. You need your expert witnesses too, and other witnesses who saw what, when they saw it, how did they see it, in order to help, break it down. Another thing is, who are the potential defendants in this case? Several. NEMA, the emergency organization I already mentioned, Lagos State, as Ms. Uwam already alluded, how can you not know or have your own documentation of what actually happened? The construction company who built this particular building for TB Joshua. TB Joshua's employees, it's not enough to think it's just a TB Joshua issue. What about the employees? Did they have something like an explosive device? Also, the fact that some of them allegedly prevented people from coming onto the land to rescue people that needed to be rescued. But sometimes employees can do things that also cause an explosion or, hazardous situation. The builders and the architects, because we have to go back to the beginning of the design of this building. So if the design is in and of itself flawed in the first place, a lot of the families who have been affected can sue all these different parties. NEMA, Lagos State, the construction company, TB Joshua's employees, the builders and the architects, and any other third parties that may be involved in this. So the central question Ms. Uwam has already addressed is, we're asking, was it a structural defect or was it terrorism? Those are two key things we need to address. Let me get Ms. Uwam's feedback on the bribery issue, and then we'll come back and talk about the civil and criminal liability that she's already outlined, and really take a look at some aspects of the law.
It's not just a structural issue. It's not just a question of whether it is terrorist act. I think you alluded to it earlier. It's whether there were any negligent conduct in the building from an employee or a church member, someone maybe that ended up causing the explosion. So there could be a lot of, factors here. It could be an electrical line that was, messed up or defective, and no one cared to fix it, and it ended up causing such an explosion and such grave damage. As to the bribery issue, obviously, when you are a journalist accepting money and yet you're supposed to report a story, you've just compromised your integrity and, more than anything else, the perspective that you're going to be reporting this story from. If you don't think that we are influenced, we are absolutely influenced, whether we want to or not. You have your conscious bias and then you have your unconscious bias. And those things do exist, no matter how professional, how careful you want to be. So you have to guard against that as much as possible. It sucks. Again, it goes to the PR part of this. If he has a right management team watching over him, no, they should have advised him not to even do that nonsense or even have that meeting with the reporters to begin with. And if he chooses to have a meeting, giving them $50,000 for gas, are you kidding me? Yeah, that's no matter how much you try to camouflage what is it? The attempt to bribe someone. That's so obvious. When it's all said and done, Pastor, you need to be about God in your actions. It needs to be godly too. You need to demonstrate that. Trying to shut people up not to report a story is not godly at all. I'm sorry.
Okay, so we transition from that and let's look at a little bit more of the law. But before we do that, from an attorney perspective, just strictly thinking litigation and how a lawsuit will go. The first thing first, for a lot of the families that are listening and saying, you know what, I want to institute a legal action against, all those different players that I already mentioned, which could be the architect, the engineers, the general contractors, the manufacturers even of some of the materials that were used to build the building, the mechanical contractors, the mechanical engineers, the owner, TB Joshua, and of course the state. One of the critical things from a legal perspective and that your lawyers over there should be doing is getting copies of all contracts that might be in the possession of all these potential defendants, getting copies of all specifications, getting copies of all construction drawings. That way, the lawyer is able to see the full picture of what actually happened or what did not happen with respect to this case. Remember, I also said there are qualified experts that need to come into play. Those qualified experts will need construction documents also. Your job as an attorney would be to preserve evidence, photos, all kinds of stuff, pre-collapse evidence before the actual building collapsed, and of course, after the fact also. And of course, state files. Ms. Huan was already talking about how can you not have these things. So from a legal standpoint, if you're going to look into prosecuting this case, you want the permits, you want the inspection reports, you want the photos. All those things are very important. Now, once you've gathered all this evidence through your investigators and other third parties, and of course, families that are listening to this that are affected will, want their lawyers to do all these things. The thing then is strategically, what are the kinds of claims that you can bring against all these different potential defendants, the architect, engineers, TB Joshua, etc. And that's where we divvy it up to two areas, civil litigation and criminal litigation. Criminal courts, we're looking at potential manslaughter, culpable homicide, and whether that could potentially be something that is part of what is available to the families. And it could potentially be, once we figure out the wrongdoing. So far, so good, we don't know. But that's definitely a very plausible situation where the state itself could go ahead and prosecute the defendants here in terms of a criminal liability, criminal culpability. On the civil part, which is part of what I want to actually focus more on, we would be looking at situations of possible breach of contracts. Contractually, you entered into a relationship, it didn't work out the way you said it was going to, and here you are with this, crazy liabilities, strictly from purely contract perspective. Under tort law, there's something called negligence. We certainly would want to look at that. We want to look at breach of warranties. So still under contract law, certain warranties when you build a building, there's express warranties or implied warranties or statutory warranties under Nigerian statutory codes governing this area that essentially say, hey, you know what? The building won't be collapsing just because you built the building. That's part of the warranties that are inherent in building that building. And then there's the concept of what's called strict product liability. We won't be getting into that as much, but it sort of will come, or it comes into play, particularly if the manufacturers are sued, because if they created or used any kind of defective components, then we would be looking at theories of strict liability. Okay, so let me wrap it up on this particular case with a theory of negligence. But remember, there are all these causes of action that can be brought. Negligence, the families can look to sue under a wrongful death action under a negligence theory. Nigerian tort law is very similar to UK tort law, UK common law, tort law, as well as the US. And so for these three different countries, the analysis is the same when you look at negligence claims. And that is that basically, in this instance, we're just focusing on TB Joshua. TB Joshua had a duty of care when he had those visitors and his employees in that building, that 6-story building. He had a duty of care to make sure that no harm will essentially come against the persons that are under his building and under his watch. And the argument would be that he breached that duty of care. And because he breached that duty of care, it caused the harm that eventually befell this persons. So under the causation theory, there's something called proximate cause, a direct approximate cause, and what we call a but-for cause. So the argument would be that it caused this harm, and ultimately you discuss the damages. That is basically the thrust of the analysis in very simple form, that it was foreseeable that if you didn't use the right materials, if you didn't use if you didn't follow or reduce the harm or risk that you were supposed to, that this kind of tragedy, unfortunately, will happen. And particularly in Nigeria now, it's not uncommon to hear about cheap materials being used to build buildings and buildings being erected real fast and a lot of collapsations happening, as well as just really, really crappy kind of buildings going up. So arguably, this is foreseeable that if indeed the pastor was aware of this materials, or that he should not have built extra buildings onto this 2-story building or 4-story building, depending on the state or NEMA, whose version of the facts you take, that this kind of situation will happen. So that's the theory of negligence. Expect to see a lot of it here. One last point would be the employees and their families that may be or are affected by this. There's the concept of workers' compensation. In the US, we have a workers' compensation. It's like a no-fault based theory of workers' compensation. So as an employee, if you get injured while doing the services or work of your employer, you're entitled to get compensated, to be taken care of, your medicals taken care of, and any other kind of damages under that theory. Well, Nigeria has a similar workers' compensation law. And it's also no fault based. So I expect, of course, the employees to also file some sort of action under their workers' compensation theory in order for them to be able to recover. Ms. Uwam, did you want to add anything to this?
I think we've pretty much summed up most of what might happen here. I do hope that the church has very good insurance, and I mean excellent insurance, because that's a lot of payout that they are potentially looking to deal with and literally can bankrupt them. I would also say it's kind of hard to do an analysis on negligence when we don't have this information. And so we're kind of throwing things out there, but they really don't have a connection yet until we really get the full story. Because negligence then becomes really more about if the pastor had behaved or had a role to play in the explosion, whether it had to do with the structure of the building in terms of him maybe there wasn't in fact an inspection, a structural inspection, and he ignored it. Maybe he was putting some hazardous stuff in the building that shouldn't have been there. I mean, there could be so many things. But ultimately what it boils down to is this: make sure you have great insurance, because at the end of the day, this is also going to come down to monetary stuff. You need to have good PR. Seriously. Stop being in front of the camera, pastor, and let people who really know how to deal with crisis management be the ones in front of the camera speaking on your behalf. And then, try to be sensitive. If you don't know how to, ask someone to teach you how to. Because this is a very damning stuff going on now, and people really don't need to see and hear from a pastor who seems to be out of touch.
I agree with that. He has gotten in front of the public, and even gone as far as to say people that are speaking badly about the situation will experience the same fate that those who perished in this tragic situation, will basically experience the same fate, which implicitly means that they too will die. And so that's really crazy for a pastor to be speaking that way, and particularly somebody who says he's a man of God. At least those statements are allegedly connected with him. Ms. Uwam raises some really interesting points, but the real one I want to focus on when she says, we don't really have enough facts even to talk about a negligence analysis. And the whole idea is just to sort of put out what the legal theories are, but that there's more fact gathering. Very true. But I also want to emphasize that even under a negligence theory, whether we're talking explosion or not, there is a certain implied duty, depending on the status of the person that comes onto your land, even under Nigerian tort law and certainly under U.S. tort law. So basically, if you invite someone to your land, or basically, by when I say land, to come on your premises and do business or for your benefit, then you are basically, that person is considered an invitee, and you have a duty to make reasonable inspections and to make sure that that property is safe. So we're still going to go back to that fact gathering that Ms. Uwam talked about. What did you know? What did you not know? Did you take the time to inspect and make reasonable inspections? And did you fix and keep the place safe? All right, so that wraps it up. We've talked a lot of law stuff today, a lot of legal analysis to give you all insight. Let's keep it light. And let's finish that with a story that's really funny, although not so funny, though, because people are really affected by it. The Ebola, depending on who pronounces it, case. So Akon recently went to Africa to perform. And while performing there, he performs in a large-sized balloon or bubble. And supposedly he did that to avoid getting Ebola. I don't know how true this is, but that seems to be a little too crazy. What do you guys think? Ms. Uwam, what's your perspective on this?
So he performed in a bubble. Over and over. It's funny, but it really isn't funny because the Ebola crisis is real. People are truly losing their lives. But I mean, should a performer not protect themselves when they're in a country that they're aware has a very serious disease spreading and going around? I mean, Akon wants to be around to make his money. You know what I mean? So performing in a bubble, I'm not quite sure that I wouldn't perform in a bubble too. I mean, it goes to tell you that he is so crazy about his money that he can't even say no. Obviously, he's not, I don't know what he's good with. Akon has been doing in the last who knows what. So maybe Akon is not making money. Besides, how many kids does he have? Like 20 kids or so? A man has to support all his children. And how many kids does he have? I don't know. Okay, I'm just being funny, but the truth of the matter is I think he has a lot of kids, so he has to feed his children. So yeah, if you have to, as a parent, if you have to feed your kids, if you have to perform in a bubble, guess what? You'll perform in a bubble so you can feed your kids, even if that pisses off your fans, because you do not want someone throwing the panties on stage, soiled with crap, and touches you or touches your mouth. I'm serious. What are you talking about? We're talking about Ebola and Ebola. What's that got to do with anything? You can get that through fluid exchanges. So if someone puts crap fluid inside their thing and it touches into, maybe accidentally as you're singing, it catches your mouth and you lick that stuff accidentally, that's a problem. So Akon, I hear you, my brother. You look silly in that bubble, but hey, if that's how you got to make your money, you keep on keeping on.
That was in the Democratic Republic of Congo, not Liberia or all these other places that are more infected with it. So people had different theories. You said you would possibly. Well, would you go to Africa at this point with all the Ebola that's been passed around if you're asked to come speak?
I'm going to decline to answer that question, pursuant to the advice of my attorney. We're going to go back to the subject matter of Mr. Akon. I don't know even if you're in Congo, I think Congo actually has had experience with Ebola. Actually, I believe that's where it may have first started it. So Akon is in the bubble, people. The man thinks he looks great. He's pointing over there with his, head, pointing out or whatever he's doing. It's silly. It's ridiculous. But hey, has he given any? I don't think he's given any statement as to why he was in the bubble. I tell you what, Akon, the next time you do a concert in the United States, get in the bubble.
It was all fun. He's been to Africa, at least Nigeria before this, performed in Calabar and performed in a bubble. So I guess that's his new signature when he's in Africa. So people just let him be. Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening to the African Music Law podcast show. On the website, you should see an easy way to leave voicemails. Go ahead and leave your voicemails and your feedback, and I will be sure to listen to it and maybe even add it to our next podcast series to hear what you all have to say about some of the topics we covered today. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe via iTunes and Stitcher Radio, or directly go on the website www.africanmusiclaw.com to see how to easily subscribe to our newsletter. Until next time, have a great one, and we'll talk soon. Cheers, people.